Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker, and I am so pleased today to have James Guay with me today. He is a marriage and family therapist working in West Hollywood, primarily with LGBTQ youth, adults, and couples since the mid-90s. And besides co-leading annual workshops, he also films a frequent psychoeducational video. What's the name of that, James? What do you call that?
It's my YouTube channel is Building Self-Esteem. I also co-host a talk show with my co-host Heather Dawn, and that is the James and Heather Show.
Okay, yeah, because I've seen some of those, and they're really great and very informational.
Thanks.
So I'll be definitely linking to those. And they focus on topics such as coming out, communication skills, creating boundaries, and sexuality. And so that's just an exciting thing that you're involved with. James testified in the California State Capitol, successfully advocating for them to ban the psychologically abusive practice of sexual orientation change efforts, or I guess what I call it in shorter terms is reparative therapies. Mm-hmm. And that is what we're going to be here to talk about today. This is a very interesting aspect of our culture that is coming around in the last few years. There's been several states now, I believe. Are we up to 6 or 7 now?
We are. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. The groundswell of effort and grassroots efforts to get this happening. Even the president and the U.S. Surgeon General have come out against conversion therapy.
Yeah, so, it's pretty amazing. And one of our own Mormon members, Michael Ferguson, I don't know if you're familiar with his name, but he was very instrumental in one of the hearings out in New Jersey and and testifying around some of the experiences that he had going through reparative therapies as well. So that is what we're here to talk about, to help either parents or ecclesiastical leaders or youth or young adults themselves understand some of the background of these issues and what is still happening in our country today and what you want to kind of be aware of when it comes especially to good mental health and good sexual health. So welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to, I guess, introduce yourself with, or am I leaving anything out about your history or?
Sure. Well, I was a teenager that went through the whole ex-gay conversion therapy approach. I grew up in a very fundamentalist Christian, born-again sort of family. And so I have experienced this, firsthand as a teenager, as well as a marriage and family therapist helping other LGBTQ youth and adults deal with the real harms that are the net result of this kind of abusive psychological practice called conversion therapy. So, yeah, I have kind of different perspectives firsthand and as a provider helping people to heal from this experience.
Yeah, and I was really interested in getting you on due to several of those things. I mean, usually I would interview Mormons who've been through this kind of thing, but I think sometimes it's helpful to step back from our own Mormon language and see how this isn't just a Mormon issue and that it's not just Mormons that harm in this way and that it's a larger cultural issue and kind of understand how this is playing out in the culture at large. So would you be willing to tell us a little bit more about the type of faith background you came from and maybe some of the messages you grew up hearing about homosexuality and how that was framed in your particular religious circles?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, I was brought up in a fundamentalist Christian family. My dad was a pastor for most of my life. He passed away about 3 years ago now. So it was a very, Monday through Friday, going to private school and chapel, and Wednesday night, Sunday morning, Sunday night, oftentimes other days of the week, going to church for Sunday school and service. So, I lived and breathed this sort of lifestyle for most of my years as a youth. So it was all I knew. I didn't really get much of any other kind of perspective. And so I absolutely adopted all of the belief systems and core values and that sort of upbringing brings with it, which of course brings a lot of really wonderful sense of community and some valuable core values and things like that. But when it comes to sexual and gender minorities, LGBTQ youth and adults, it's just it's often not a very positive experience. In fact, it can be very, very damaging to the health and well-being of LGBTQ members. So, one of my first memories was being 4 years old and accepting Jesus into my life in the kitchen of my home with my dad, and lots and lots of experiences like that. We read through the Bible, Genesis through Revelations, 2-3 times through as a family every year for a bit, and once I really connected the dots to my own sense of sexual attractions towards other guys and what that meant, and it became, something that was an every day, every minute, practically moment of my life where I was rejecting that aspect of myself, where I was trying to change it, where I was praying to God, where I was going to every church service I could and get my hands on any material, even related to healing and letting go and moving on and those kinds of things. It was a very, in retrospect, traumatic experience to having been brought up in that way, believing that there's something fundamentally flawed about who I am that I didn't choose to experience. It just naturally arose for me. So I remember in middle school being bullied for having a gender variance and expressing my mannerisms differently than my peers. They would sort of poke fun and sexually harass me. This was, again, a private school, Los Angeles Baptist High School. It didn't really, that kind of thing didn't end until I confronted those bullies and, demanded that they stop. And eventually that did happen.
At what age? Like, when were you able to do that?
I went to a school counselor and we role played different ways of responding to the bullies. And and I remember one incident where it was happening. I got a bunch of kids in a classroom, my math class. I turned around, I pointed my finger like I had role played, and I looked directly at the bully and I said, "You need to stop that now." And that might not work in today's society and culture in certain schools or dynamics, but in that environment at that time, it was effective. He was embarrassed. I'd never, confronted him like that before, and they realized I wasn't going to continue to take it. So that was useful. But again, there's all kinds of subversive and unconscious and other kinds of ways that many rigid or strict fundamentalist, whatever religion it is, environments often perpetuate, whether it's through silence and sort of heterosexism, that only things pertaining to heterosexuals are talked about or discussed, and anything of sexual or gender diversity is not even acknowledged. So some sense of erasure. There's harm that can be caused by that, all the way up to bullying from the pulpit and from peers in churches and in religious organizations that believe that there's something inherently evil about same-sex attraction or gender diversity.
So how old were you when you started understanding that there was maybe something different about you, that you were having feelings for same-sex boys?
Yeah.
What was that process like for you, just developmentally?
Sure. Well, I remember in retrospect being attracted to boys my age around 9 or 10 years old. I just sort of noticed, and I didn't really think of it as, I was 9 or 10 years old in a very conservative environment where these discussions never really took place much. So I didn't really know what it was about, so I just sort of ignored it. But, hitting puberty, of course, for many of us, our sexual feelings and sexuality sort of come to the front. And that was when, I could no longer sort of ignore or deny that I was attracted to other boys my age. And so it was surprising that I was fairly popular or liked, and then went to middle school and was then bullied and ridiculed by kids in some ways before I even sort of connected the dots. This often happens in middle school where any kind of gender variance gets demeaned and devalued, especially for boys that appear to others to act like women or girls. It's kind of connected to sexism, the devaluation of women or anything feminine, that sometimes tomboys or tomgirls, sort of don't experience necessarily the same kind of vitriolic reaction to crossing gender lines. So yeah, it became something that tormented me. Like I said, I prayed virtually every single day, read the Bible, went to, joined all these groups. In 8th grade, upon graduation from junior high school, I was elected by my peers and teachers as a couple different awards for being like the best Christian, best Christian witness. And all the while feeling like I was a complete failure and was hiding something that I knew would bring much, much ridicule if I ever shared it. So I felt fake. I felt like a fraud, even though my intent was to rid this thing from my very being. Pretty much from ages 12 to 16, I tried everything I could to get rid of it myself, these feelings, these thoughts. Remember going to a Christian bookstore, and I was a very shy kid. Went to a Christian bookstore, searched for the only book I could find on this topic, and nervously went to the cash register, purchased the book, and she looked at me and said, "Is this for you or someone else?" And I said it was for me, and she very sweetly at the time, and in that context, was like, "Well, I'll pray for you." And she said it in a very kind way. Realized that nothing was working. My feelings were still there. They were increasing. A lot of the shame that I was experiencing was turning into self-hatred. And I was starting to be very depressed and inflict self-harm. And so let's see, I'm just trying to recollect here. My mom found some slices on my arms. I'd injured myself, and confronted me. And by that time, I had already told my sisters about, being gay, and had come out to my dad, but not to my mom. And so they found, I told them what was going on, and they searched and found an ex-gay Christian psychologist for me to work with at age 16. So I met with him weekly for about a year to, again, try, conversion therapy as an approach to getting rid of these feelings that I had.
Okay, so before we get into that, so tell me a little bit about what, if anything, were you hearing explicitly over the pulpit? You called it pulpit bullying. So were there topics of homosexuality coming up that you would actually hear? Maybe your father or other preachers or pastors or whatever your tradition calls them.
Right. Yeah, there were. It was the head pastor of the church that we went to. It was Grace Community Church, probably over 10,000 members at that time. And it was, like I said, rarely talked about, but when it was, maybe once every year or so, there was a sermon about it. It was just vitriolic, just really awful, nasty, lots of stereotypes of LGBTQ people. And you could just hear the audience, the members' reactions, sighs, comments, those kinds of things as this sort of sermon would ensue. There was a particular memory I have of being in junior high school and youth ministry, and listening to the youth pastor talk to a bunch of us about this topic. And I remember specifically him saying, "There's probably even one or two of you here that are gay. And, once he said that, I remember distinctly, like, all my peers were like, ew, no, yuck, gross. And what felt to me like I just flushed red and was like heart palpitating, trying to not make it evident that I felt targeted in that kind of way.
What were some of the stereotypes that they would say?
Yeah, well, just, the basic ones, like you can't be happy and be LGBTQ, that you're perverted, that you're an abomination to God, that you're going to hell, that, this was sort of in the midst of the 80s, mid to late 80s, where AIDS was new. And so that was used as a tactic to say that it was a natural byproduct of being LGBTQ. It was a punishment from God, those kinds of messages. So, just lots and lots of just cruel speech, hate speech, quite frankly, when it came to talking about LGBTQ people. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about this process of actually talking. It sounds like you talked to your sisters first, and then your dad, and then your mom. So what was that like? I mean, that must have been pretty difficult.
That was something. Yeah. My sister, one of my sisters, was the first person that I came out to. We drove to the top of sort of an overlook over the San Fernando Valley in Southern California and parked.
This is during high school?
Yeah, this was, oh gosh, I want to say I was maybe 14 or 15, something like that. Anyway, I told her that there was something that I wanted to share, but I was really nervous. And so she ended up sharing some very personal things herself to help me feel better in doing the same. And it did have that net effect, where I ended up telling her about this. And part of the coming out for me to these family members at that time was I have these same-sex attractions and I don't want them. It wasn't like, yay, I'm gay, accept me. It was, oh, I have this horrible thing I've been struggling with for years. I don't like it. I've tried to rid myself of it and it's still here. And so we ended up crying together. She was very loving and caring and supportive, and she asked if she could tell my other sister, and I said yes. And so they were sort of the first two people in my life I had shared this with.
And so in their way, in their Christian way, they were very supportive in the sense of being present, being willing to listen, trying to offer you love and support.
Exactly. Yeah, they really didn't give me the hellfire and damnation speech I'd already heard plenty of times before. They, of course, from their own religious beliefs, were concerned about my eternal life and well-being, but yeah, mostly just expressed love and care and concern. So, that in and of itself was incredibly freeing, because like we know, as MFTs, as marriage and family therapists, shame operates in silence, right? And it grows, it perpetuates, and it becomes insidious in our lives. So being able to share that in a context where I felt loved and cared for was incredibly healing, and in a large part of what saved my life. The thoughts I was having about suicide and the desire to end my life, the only thing that was really stopping me from doing so was this religious belief that if I did that I would live in eternal damnation in hell, which I believed would be a worse existence than I was having in life. So otherwise, it's very likely that I would have attempted it.
Well, and this kind of mirrors the work that Dr. Caitlin Ryan is doing. Are you familiar with her work with the Family Acceptance Project?
I love her work. She's great. Yes.
Yeah. And so her biggest thing is, obviously, you can't just go in and change people's religious beliefs or values, nor should we try to necessarily. What your sisters did was accepting practices, even though they may be held religious beliefs that we would not find helpful to LGBTQ members, but
right.
At the same time, they weren't ostracizing you or being overly dramatic or telling on you, right? Or I mean, they just kind of sat with your information and offered you love and support, and just being able to do that, even if your beliefs are in this line, can be so helpful to youth and to people that need that type of support. So that's really wonderful.
Yeah, the thing I love about Caitlin Ryan's work is she shows through, scientific research how if parents go from even just an incremental change from, say, being outright hateful and abusive towards their child to being slightly less so, or even neutral, makes a huge difference in the outcomes of their child in terms of their mental health and well-being later in life. And her research and the videos that she's produced and that her team has done, I think, like you said, really helps parents not necessarily force them to have to change their religious belief systems, but recognize that the things that they say and communicate to their child has a demonstrative difference in their health and well-being throughout their life.
Well, and just from a bias perspective, so much of her work has been around LDS families, so we are like totally benefiting from that.
That's wonderful. That's great.
One of her pamphlets is directed to LDS families, and then her video, Families Are Forever, is with a Mormon family who has just done incredible work, and the mother in that particular video is now the head of the Mama Dragons. I don't know if you've heard of them, but
I love the title.
Yeah, they are fiercely protecting their LGBTQ youth.
That's great. That's great.
They're just really started a lot of really good things. Well, tell me a little bit then about actually telling your dad. So what was the impetus for that? You had the support from your sisters. Did you feel like you wanted to tell your dad, or did your dad confront you, or no? And do you think your family knew as well, kind of like your middle school kids did? Or was it a shock to them?
I'm not exactly sure. I think it definitely was a shock to my mom. My dad, back in the day, sort of ridiculed me for being overly sensitive, which can be language for acknowledging my gender variance as a boy, not fitting into standard sort of macho scripts that boys are supposed to follow. But yeah, basically the reason that I came out to my dad was because I wanted help. I had exhausted all my resources, and I wanted some sort of counseling assistance. And so he, I think this was actually before I came out to him, I did see a Christian counselor who ended up reading me the Bible and some passages, and I actually never ended up telling him that I was gay. I think I acknowledged that I was struggling with masturbation or something like that. I sort of checked out his level of helpfulness in that area, and then he was saying it was good that I was dealing with this because otherwise I could become gay if I kind of took it too far and started doing it with other boys or that kind of thing. And I realized from that statement, I was like, well, I've never done it with anyone else and I'm still gay, so he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I've read the same biblical passages probably more than he has, so that's not going to help me. So that was a quick sort of experience, 2-3 session sort of experience, probably when I was around 13, 14 years old. But yeah, so I really wanted to let my dad know what was going on. I felt like he'd gone through his own experiences within the church, sort of behind the scenes, being ostracized, and some things coming out about his own personal life and experiences that I felt like he would have greater empathy for me as a result of those experiences that he had had. So, and I was right. He was seemingly loving and caring, non-shaming of me, although, like my sisters, concerned about my internal life and well-being. So eventually, like I said, he did ask around at church. At the time, the Grace Community Church, I don't know if they still see this way, but they at the time saw psychotherapy or counseling as a sort of man-made of the world treatment practice that was unnecessary, but apparently for us extreme cases, they found someone that had the specialization, who also happened to have specialized in those recovering from satanic ritual abuse, supposedly. So that was the Christian therapist I ended up working with for a year, someone who specialized in conversion therapy and those who had suffered from satanic ritual abuse. Some pretty off-kilter populations.
Wow.
That Christian community. Yeah.
Right. So your dad responded in again a supportive way, and your mom, you said, had maybe a harder time accepting it, or was also supportive.
Well, she was. In many ways, I was much closer to her than my dad growing up. But and when I first came out to her, she was very supportive in terms of wanting me to access help and supporting me in changing my sexual orientation from gay to straight in whatever ways that she thought that could happen. Later on, when I ended up accepting my sexual orientation, she sort of reversed course and was, very, very, very upset at my change of course. So, but initially, for the first few years there, 16 to 20 years old or so, she was supportive of me trying to change.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, and one thing I just want to point out to the audience that you've been kind of describing the whole way through, which is very typical of how I see a lot of my LGBTQ youth, is that in a sense you were the super Christian. You were getting the super Christian award, right? You were probably reading scriptures more than any other teen. You were probably on your knees praying more than any other teen. You were probably super committed. I mean, you're going into a bookstore trying to find books to help yourself type of teen. And, I see this so much in my Mormon kids where they're, preparing for missions and like so gung-ho and fasting and testifying and just all the different things, having their callings and just really, really trying more than anything to be a righteous young man or woman in the church. And then they get, in a sense, kind of rewarded for that. Kind of like you got your reward, right? Like, these are awesome kids, right? These are super spiritual, gung-ho. They're going to be the leaders of our church without any understanding of the internal struggle that they're constantly, struggling with, that you so well described. So that's just an interesting thing to be aware of with some of these kiddos who take it so deeply to heart, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into then what this experience doing therapy was like with this Christian man who is specializing in reparative and demonic practices. Which is kind of interesting from an ethical standpoint, which maybe we can talk a little bit about that as well.
Sure. Yeah, it was it was talk therapy. He was a licensed clinical psychologist, ex-gay himself, in a marriage and to a woman, and a lot of the therapy was about trying to find a root cause of why I was same-sex attracted, often what the ex-gay or conversion therapy camps called SSA, same-sex attracted. So it was about trying to find a connection between sort of feeling distant with my same-sex parent and over enmeshed with my opposite-sex parent. It was about trying to find if there was any history of sexual abuse that I might have repressed or denied or ignored. It was about that there had to be some root cause, and finding that root cause would be part of the treatment in not just recognizing it, but healing, the missed experiences that involved. So that was much of the weekly appointments I had with him. Part of it was about developing deeper same-sex friendships, which is a great goal. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it doesn't change same-sex attraction, let alone opposite sex attraction. It doesn't have anything to do with that. So my hope that these things would shift. Initially I was really buying into it. I was like, oh, maybe there's a slight difference in my attractions. There's confirmation bias that happens for a lot of people that go through conversion therapy, where, oftentimes initially there's a huge relief, like I'm not the only one going through this. There are other Christians or Mormons or Buddhists or whomever who are going through this and want to change too. So the release of that, some kind of initial shame and isolation, sometimes lessens the intensity of sexual arousal or desire. And so that can be misconstrued as it working, which was the case for me. And then I was also, he recommended that I go to ex-gay conversion or Exodus International conferences back in the day. I was the youngest person at those conferences, that probably were around 200, 300 people who attended. 16 years old, going with my dad, actually, and going to various different workshops over the course of 2-3 days in Southern California. Workshops like how to butch it up for guys, how to be more masculine, how to apply makeup for women, those kinds of workshops. And, a lot of it was really about trying to have a corrective emotional relational experience with Jesus Christ, with God. And that the hope would be that as that shifted, again, that same-sex attractions would shift. So those were a lot of the goals and the treatment plan for conversion therapy that I went through.
So mostly talk things, conferences, meeting with other people, all of these types of things. Doesn't sound like you went through some of the more maybe fringe therapies that I've heard of, like going out to the woods naked all together and going through some ritualistic kind of manly exercise or something along those lines. Is that fair to say?
That's totally fair to say. And what's interesting is that even the kind of talk therapy and seemingly quote unquote legit approach to trying to change my sexual orientation was incredibly harmful throughout my life, and was something that really took years and years and years to heal from. Because when you buy into the negative stereotypes that gay men are child molesters, or gay men can't be happy and in relationship or in long-term relationships, and that will get diseases, that we're going to hell, those kinds of, you can't help but reject that essential part of your beingness. And in so doing, it's incredibly self-annihilating. Where you learn to put on a false self to be what other people want you to be. You learn that love is based on the condition that you not be fully who you are, which is incredibly harmful. So even talk therapy,
Sure.
In and of itself, words harm. And these kinds of experiences, even if they're not as concretely egregious like shock therapy and aversion therapy and those kinds of things, is still incredibly harmful.
Right. Yeah, and I didn't mean to minimize that by any means, because I
completely
agree with that as far as just the power of persuasion, right, or suggestion, and how those things just dig so deep into our internal self-esteem and self-identity.
Sure.
I did a podcast, many years ago now, on my Mormon mental health page with an ex-client of mine, actually, that we kind of did this thing where he came to me wanting to change his orientation. He was married. He was kind of in a desperate situation with 2 kids, and I was like, well, I've never really kind of heard of changing orientation. And I was very green, I was right out of my master's degree. And I was working for LDS Family Social Services at the time. And so I contacted them and as a contractor. So I wasn't really in their office. I wasn't quite as I guess, into their resources as maybe I would have been otherwise. But so they sent me all these kinds of books that you're talking about. And we went through that list. We went through the list of enmeshed parent and distant parent and child sexual abuse. And with him, unfortunately, what happened, I think, for both of us is that it checked off. Like every single thing that they said probably was happening had happened. And I was like, goodness, maybe there is something to this. Like it made me wonder, is there something here I'm missing or not understanding? And so we went through the whole podcast about what treatment was like with me and how in the end we all kind of came to the same conclusion, but it was kind of like a mutual education, which I'm not sure was super ethical, right? That they had to mutually educate me. But it was really the turn of my whole career in understanding that this was something that, first of all, I had not received, I think, sufficient training in to stop me from even going down that road. And secondly, just how damaging it was to so many people to have to go to these types of therapies that you're talking about.
Right. Well, I think you bring up a good point, which is that we don't really get trained as therapists in how to be LGBTQ culturally competent, and let alone about sexuality and sex. It's just, if we get anything, it's usually, one class or a one-off discussion or those kinds of things. And so, you're not alone. Many, 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 many therapists, because we're taught to be, to meet clients where they're at, to let the client guide the goals of treatment, those kinds of things, that sometimes we slip into this arena where it's like, well, they want to change, I don't have any value about them changing or not changing, but this is what they're asking for. How can I help them? And I think what's important for therapists to recognize is that we're also supposed to do no harm, right? And that even, through the kindness and compassion of someone like yourself or anyone else that wants to be there for their client and to meet those kinds of needs, that even that can be harmful, that it's like one of those things, I have an analogy sometimes for this. If a client, were anorexic coming into treatment to lose weight, to lose more weight, it would be unethical for a therapist to help them to do so, because we know through research that it is the number one psychological diagnosis that is the most lethal. And so if we were to help a client on their own volition, voluntarily coming to treatment, wanting to lose weight, if we were to help them do so, we're actually harming them. And so as a profession, we need to look at what is ethical, what isn't, what's harmful, what's not, and take a stand. And I'm really happy to see that most of our professional organizations have taken a stance against this treatment approach. So that, that's one way of educating its members, other therapists, that not only is this ineffective, but it's harmful. So it's a process of learning for all of us.
Yeah. Well, and that goes for the organization that I helped found, which is the Mormon Mental Health Association. We have that as one of our positions as well. But I love that you said that, because I've had a love-hate relationship with this term, meet your clients where you're at, for a long, long time. For a lot of the reasons that you just mentioned, because it's not just come in and we'll work on goals together. Obviously, that's the ideal situation when people are working towards general goals, like, increased mental health or increased relational health or parenting skills or whatever it is. But when it comes to your example of anorexia is a very good one, but also these ideas of sexual addiction, which, isn't a diagnosis, or like this orientation. I think we also play as much of a role in psychoeducation, and not just, oh yeah, sure, whatever you bring to my table is perfectly fine. And, because otherwise we can harm. So I really appreciate you saying that. And I think that maybe this goes into the discussion as to why these clinicians are allowed to practice, in my position, unethically to begin with, right? Like this therapist that's working around demonic interventions and reparative therapies, and he's trained. What did you say he was trained?
A psychologist.
As a clinical psychologist, which I'm pretty familiar with their ethical codes, right? And how they're supposed to be practicing, and how religion is supposed to be one of those biases that we are supposed to be checking, as clinicians. And I see this, I market myself as a Mormon therapist. I'm not saying you can't market yourself as a therapist who is culturally competent in whatever religious faith you come from, but to then project your religion onto your clients, whether it's a Christian counselor or a Mormon therapist or whatever it is, just seems so clearly opposite of what our ethical codes are about. And because this is happening all over the place. So, I mean, I'm living here in the Bible Belt, and I see it all around me, and I see it all around my Mormon world in Utah and Idaho and those types of places. And what is the disconnect? What is the disconnect between ethical education that we get when we go to our ethics practices and this disconnect between clinicians, I think, acting unethically with their religious boundaries all the time?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there needs to be standards of care, and there are certain standards of care, but most of the code of ethics for various different professional associations don't come out specifically against various different treatment approaches. They come out in favor of ways of working with clients, and much of them can be interpreted to acknowledge that conversion therapy shouldn't be practiced. But I don't think the professional associations in and of themselves have gone far enough as it relates to this kind of thing. The other thing is that for someone to file a complaint with a state board or with a professional association, for a client to do so with their prior conversion therapist, it often takes years and years and years for the conversion therapy survivor to debrief from this sort of situation, to come to a greater sense of acceptance and awareness of how harmful this was. And it's just an incredibly damaging and difficult process. So they're not as likely to come out specifically and do an ethics complaint, file an ethics complaint against their conversion therapist. And so these, many of these times, these conversion therapists continue to practice where it's still legal to do so. In 2012, California was the first state in the country to ban conversion therapy on minors by licensed clinicians in that state. New Jersey was in 2013, Washington, D.C. in 2014, and Oregon and Illinois in 2015. So there's a trend here, but there's still, most states allow conversion therapy practices on minors, adults, and anything else. There is legislation on the national level, the Therapeutic Fraud Prevention Act, that got introduced, I think, last year. And, it would essentially ban the practice of conversion therapy on people of all ages, not just for sexual orientation, but for gender identity, for any practitioner, even if they're not licensed, if they charge for the service. So that's one possibility, that could really help to change this dynamic. But I think more professional associations need to come out more demonstratively about their opposition to this treatment approach. And I think there's public education that's happening too, where more and more people are becoming aware that it's still, this treatment approach exists, and they're becoming more and more aware that it's harmful. So.
Before I ask any more questions, because I want to go into more in depth what denotes reparative therapy, you've been talking about it all along, like the depression, suicidality, self-esteem issues, et cetera, et cetera. But do you want to do a concise list as to why reparative therapies are harmful?
The kinds of harm, or why, or both?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, whenever human beings, we are told that we're evil, an abomination, that some aspect of us is unacceptable, that we shouldn't have the right to work, to live, to be protected from discrimination, that has an impact on our sense of self and our value and our worth. Most LGBTQ people grow up in very invalidating environments where we're not even acknowledged. And yet, if you add to that some of the vitriolic sort of accusations against LGBTQ people, it's tenfold. And so it's, the natural byproduct of that sort of thing is a rejection of self. It's living inauthentically. And whenever we do that, that brings up depression, anxiety, self-hatred, self-harm, thoughts of suicide, and difficulties with relationships, difficulties with sex or sexuality, because, we don't have a healthy sense of self, that our sexual desires are natural and healthy and can be embraced in a way that is not only pleasurable, but is helps to deepen relationships and connections that we have with others. So this kind of homophobia, societal, that shows up in some people's offices, conversion therapist offices, just has a really horrible, awful impact on clients because of that.
Yeah, so just to kind of give you a little bit of what a Mormon, maybe more Orthodox believing might say is like, well, we love gay people. We're more about love the sinner, hate the sin. Obviously, we can't change God's laws, and so we can't accept behaviors that would be contrary to God's laws, but that doesn't mean that we're not loving. That doesn't mean that we don't want them to attend, even though obviously if you're acting in any way, we're going to probably discipline you in some way, but that's not going to be overtly said. And then, and we feel like this is just a weakness. Like, we all have weaknesses. I mean, we all have stuff that we'd like to do and don't, so we don't really get what the big deal is about that. And sure, you're expected to be celibate the rest of your life, but there's a lot of us that have issues like that, like people maybe who are mentally challenged or disabled in some way and can't find a mate. And so, it's sad and that's unfortunate, but we love you.
Amazing.
And let me just read, because I want to talk a little bit about what types of reparative therapies. I think our church has kind of moved away from, I think they've kind of finally accepted that orientation is not going to change. Yeah. And so this comes from the Evergreen and North Star website. And it says, so since its founding more than 20 years ago as a support organization for the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which this is kind of some interesting things where these organizations will say, well, we're not officially tied to the church, but they have all of the church information on here. All right. And then Evergreen's mission has always been similar to North Star's and its desire to assist those who experience, again, like you said, same-sex attraction. We're not going to call it in a way that people can identify, so we're going to call it an issue, same-sex attraction, and who desire to live in harmony with their spiritual and religious values, which in this day and age, that means celibacy. And Evergreen International was founded on the belief that the atonement of Jesus Christ enables every soul the opportunity to turn away from all sins or conditions that obstruct their temporal and eternal happiness and potential. And that's what we're going to help you do. So they're not changing orientation. Right. But I still consider this part of this work where it is about not letting people accept themselves and not let them live full lives, right? Right. Well, and it's interesting because a lot of the things that you're reading and saying about the sort of the Mormon perspective with certain groups in the Mormon religion are the same exact things I've heard in Christian communities as well. So it's very, very similar. The whole hate the sin, not the sinner thing is sort of good luck with that one. Because it's kind of like saying hate the yarn but not the sweater. It's like such an essential part of one being such an essential part of the other that to tease out that is to eradicate who that person is to begin with. Not that that's the only thing that is a marker for who someone is, but sexuality is a huge component. So, and, I also just want to acknowledge that I've had former clients come out of the programs that you just listed, the North Star Evergreen sort of programs, and have exactly the kinds of symptoms that I'm describing, as it relates to depression and anxiety and self-harm and difficulty with sexuality and relationships and those kinds of things. So, I think these places can't get away with anymore being as outright judgmental. So it comes out in language of love
But if you dive down into the weeds, you recognize that the kinds of things that they support and say are anything but loving. They require someone to change or to let go of or not embrace in order to be loved, which is was not demonstrated by these religions, the leaders of these religions. So it's problematic in lots of different ways.
Well, and it's interesting too that they use the word condition, and what you're talking about is sexuality being an integral part of our identity, which I think is something we struggle with as a culture anyway, at large, is even with a lot of the women's issues, like, well, we're not going to pay for birth control because we're just we're just paying for you to go have sex, right? Or, like sex is this very fluffy thing that isn't really a part of human health or human life. It's just kind of an option that some of us get to enjoy type of attitude about sexuality, right? And I can't tell you how many times I've heard in my Mormon circles being gay being compared to the condition of alcoholism. That there's this drive that some people are kind of genetically disposed to that maybe, and so your chance of being an addict is higher than other people's, and that's really unfair and sad. And your body is craving something and wants something that's not healthy for you, and it's a condition that you're just kind of going to have to overcome. And that's a very, very typical way that people see these issues of sexual orientation, which then is put into a condition, like something that needs to be cured, like a disease, versus an integral part of how we're created as human beings and how we're, functioning on a day-to-day level. So I don't know if you have anything that you'd say about that, but.
Yeah, well, I hear all kinds of false analogies like that, comparing non-consensual sex to same-sex sex, right? So comparing being LGBTQ to child molestation or rape or murder or infidelity or lots of different false comparisons where it allows people who hold those beliefs to maintain those beliefs in a way that's like, this is just your burden to bear. I have my own, but it's not a fair comparison. It might help them for their arguments and like I said, to maintain their belief system, but they're not comparing apples with apples. So it's sort of it's hard to have those kinds of conversations with people who don't recognize the discrepancies there.
Yeah. All right, so we've talked a lot about what we're not happy with.
Sure.
Why don't we talk? Well, is there anything, before I go down this route, is there anything you want to say as far as the reparative types of therapies that are out there that people should be aware of or be leery towards, or make sure that they're not falling, maybe prey into some of these types of programs that we're talking about here?
Yeah. I think it's really important for people to ask lots of questions of therapists and of any kind of group like this. Really specific questions. Not all therapists are going to feel comfortable answering these questions, but I think it's a consumer right to be able to ask. And so part of that is asking what the provider's treatment approach is with someone who's LGBTQ and potentially struggling with their feelings about that. It can be asking if they've been trained in LGBTQ affirmative psychotherapy, and if so, what that experience entailed. Because there's a lot of conversion therapists who will say that they only do conversion therapy with people who want it, and that it's non-shaming, and sometimes they'll even market themselves as specializing in working with the LGBTQ population. So it's really important for clients and consumers to ask, again, very specific questions about this.
Goodness.
What are their beliefs about whether or not someone can change their sexual orientation from LGBTQ to straight and cisgender? That needs to be at least one of the questions asked.
So let's talk then about, let's say, well, one of two things. Either you've been through some of these types of treatments, or recognizing it's not working, or recognizing you need to go in a different direction. You're talking about this debriefing that needs to happen and good support networks. You're in the position where you're just starting this process of either recognizing your teen or yourself, you're coming maybe from a religious background that doesn't accept who you are as far as your sexual orientation. What types of resources, what types of steps can a family or an individual take to start heading in a healthier direction?
Well, I think, you mentioned Caitlin Ryan and her research. I would look up information like that for families that are looking into this kind of thing. She's based out of San Francisco State University, and you can look her up online. In terms of the process for people, I compare it to deprogramming from a cult-like environment, where there is such a preponderance of a manipulation of system rewards and punishments, and keeping the person unaware of any positive information about being LGBTQ, restricting their social environment, systemically creating a sense of powerlessness in the person. A lot of the conditions for thought reform, that it really does require someone to develop greater critical thinking skills on their own accord, that have been sometimes bypassed and given over to a religious leader, or even a psychotherapist, or someone else to do that for them. So it's about learning. For some, like I'm thinking back in my own life. Initially, my process was to look at the clobber passages in the Bible, as they're often referred to. The 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, however many they are, I've forgotten the number. That's a sign of good health for me. The passages in the Bible that state something specific about being LGBTQ, and learning different ways of interpreting it, putting it in its cultural context. For me, that was a really useful process for a period of time to reject some of the teachings that I had received growing up, and to see it in a different light. So there's organizations, communities of people who are LGBTQ and Mormon and Christian and, put whatever religious faith there is, that want to merge and marriage the religious beliefs with their sexual being. And so that can be really useful for people for a lifetime, or even just initially, to see their sexual orientation in a different way. There can also be learning, becoming really more intimate with ourselves, right? Like, what are our thoughts? What are our feelings? What are our needs? What are, who are we? What's important to us in relationship? What are our core values? Really, really getting to know ourselves, because there's been such a huge, long period of self-rejection that we can, kind of not understand who we are. And if we don't know who we are, then it's hard to be in relationship fully with another, and to live authentically from that place to begin with. So those are, in my mind, some of the first steps to getting out of this sort of toxic, religious, homophobic, transphobic, biphobic kind of environment.
Okay, thank you. And I'll be sure to link to a lot of the resources that I'm aware of, at least in our Mormon community. And and I'm also kind of deciding, just as we're doing this, I'm going to probably be co-releasing this with Mormon Mental Health, and also offering this free of charge, because when it comes to these issues and the type of suicidal rates that we're seeing, especially since the November policy of our church last year, I just think we can't have enough resources out there to help people. I guess I'd like to finish out the interview with 2 questions. Maybe one is letting you finish your story. We started kind of with the challenges that you started with and things that you had to overcome. And I'm guessing you're in a much better place. And so maybe if you want to finish out, how you yourself went through some healing processes and became a more self-individuated person and healthy in your relationships and such. And then just my basic last question, which is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to make sure you talk about, or kind of closing thoughts? So
Sure. Well, to finish out on a bit of my story, I obviously recognized from, ages 12 to 20 of trying to change my sexual orientation that it wasn't working, that my hopes for it changing, it just didn't come to fruition. And, I started to see some of the the dangerous aspects of a rigid fundamentalist way of thinking, even if it didn't come from religion, even if it was a political philosophy or a psychological way of being, that we're not meant to be rigid, strict human beings. That's just oftentimes that comes at such a high price, and an opposite reaction often transpires because of it. So yeah, that was a process. When I was 20, I met a person I fell in love with. I spent 6 years with. We had a wedding, and that was a huge healing experience for me, where I got to feel how natural and how loving and how caring in the context of a primary relationship that was honored and appreciated and supported by chosen family and friends. I was ultimately kicked out at age 20 by my parents on Easter Sunday, very symbolic day that it just sort of wasn't on purpose, naturally happened, but it was sort of my first steps of freedom into embracing myself. And so, from then sort of, was out from day one with any new person I was meeting. I transferred to UC Berkeley to be on their gymnastics team. Everybody on the team knew from day one. They were all loving and supportive. Got some LGBTQ affirmative therapy through the health center, joined a gay affirmative support group. All these steps sort of along the way to help me deal with the pain that I've already described. And really help to, not just accept, but appreciate what I had to offer the world as a gay man. So, yeah, from then till now, I'm age 45 now, I was 10 years in affirmative therapy, working through all kinds of stuff. And it's been a process of learning and growing, and hopefully we're learning and growing from birth till death, all of us. But it's been a particular road for me with all of this. I've had really loving, healthy relationships. I've enjoyed life and helping other people as a licensed marriage and family therapist, providing a safe place for other people to do this kind of internal work. And, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, come to embrace who they are at their core. It's really my passion and mission in life, having had the experiences I've had and wanting to help others do that work themselves too. So, yeah, it's been a journey for sure. I've been part of the board of directors for a few professional organizations, working on these kinds of causes, like you mentioned in the intro, speaking out on Capitol Hill in Sacramento in California, for first piece of legislation to ban this conversion therapy on minors by licensed professionals. So I've been speaking out and trying to get organizations organized and involved in making sure that this ends. There's the National Center for Lesbian Rights. They have a Born Perfect campaign I've been a part of. That is, their goal is to end conversion therapy in the U.S. By 2019. And they are well on their way. So
that's great. So it sounds like relationship or family relationships are still strained, maybe, for you.
They've improved. My relationship with my sisters have been good for the most part. My relationship with my brother has been strained off and on throughout the years, and continues to be to some extent now. My dad, right before he passed away, told me that he no longer thought I was going to hell, that he thought I was going to be saved because I asked Jesus into my life at age 4, and it stuck. So, it was a gesture on his part that his beliefs on that had changed, and effort on his part to demonstrate love for me, which I appreciated. Things with my mom have improved. It's been a lot of ups and downs, but we're in a much better place now. She still believes, I'm sure, that I'm going to hell, but no longer says it. And, we don't have we avoid certain topics just because we've done our best to try and flesh them out, and we believe what we believe. So yeah, it's been a process, but I also feel really well loved and supported, like I said, by family and friends and community at large, and that's a really important aspect for this kind of healing journey that I recommend other people. If you're in an environment that is toxic, is simply for your sexuality or gender identity, really, reach out to trustworthy people. It may be far and few between, depending on where you're out at the Bible Belt or otherwise. But it's, we all deserve that kind of love and support, and that's not based on a condition that we change.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And there are so many people willing to offer that, for sure. Yeah. Any closing thoughts you would just give to somebody who might be listening who's really struggling right now?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. An article that I wrote was picked up by Time.com a couple of years ago, and I just received an email from someone who read that, a 19-year-old who's living in the Bible Belt, and he wrote me an email talking about how much he identified with my experiences and sharing some of his, and wanting to know if I had any advice to offer him. And much of it is what I've shared here, that it is not only acceptable to have diversity in sexuality and in gender identity and expression. It's actually a gift that we bring society at large. We've been sort of placed in this position to be ridiculed and shamed and scapegoated by society at large, and we've had to deal with this and cope with it and come to a place of greater self-acceptance and appreciation for who we are. And that's part of what we have to offer the world: how to be more compassionate, how to live more authentically, how to be the kind of change that we want in the world. And so I guess my last piece here is just to recognize that it's not our job to make other people feel more comfortable with their homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, heterosexism. It's our job to live our lives as authentically as possible, and to do so with compassion, with thoughtfulness, with grace, and in doing so, that's part of what changes hearts and minds.
James, I can't thank you enough for your time and all the many wonderful things that you've been talking about. I think this is super helpful, and just hope that people who are out there will be touched by your story and by some of the resources that you've mentioned and ideas. And just for anybody who's out there, just know that there's so many people in your corner, and we want you to survive and thrive and do well. So thank you so much for coming on.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on and for all your support and good work you're doing.
Thanks, James.
You bet.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too. But through every storm we
traveled on like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.